Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really pleased to have with me as my guest Keith Enright, who's a partner at Gibson Dunn. Keith, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Richard. Happy to be here.
So, Keith, you've got a really interesting career and background. I hope we'll get to all of it, but maybe let me just start by asking, why you went to law school in the first place.
Sure. I mean, I could burn through all of our time talking about that. It's a strange meandering story. I was an indecisive student. I did two undergraduate degrees and two minors. So
Oh,
on
wow.
the one hand, I was incredibly interested in history and looking backwards. On the other side, I was always massively interested in technology and the way that it was changing the way people lived.
Hmm.
Um, as I was coming out of undergrad, it really did seem like there were really interesting things happening in society, the birth of the internet, the way that that was changing life and business. And I actually thought being a lawyer would be a really interesting way to help shape the way that technology was going to
Hmm.
affect people's lives.
Hmm. Did you have a family of lawyers? Did anyone inspire you to think about that? No?
No history. I would say, my father was the child of Irish immigrants, and
Oh.
they definitely put the legal profession on a very high pedestal.
Hmm.
So from the time I was really young, it was an aspirational career for someone to be a lawyer
Hmm.
was perceived as quite an accomplishment.
Yeah. Well, did you have any idea what kind of lawyer you were going to be when you started law school?
It's funny. I went to George Washington, which at the time was renowned for being a patent law factory, among
Uh-huh.
other things. So I thought I would be a patent lawyer. I was very unsophisticated at the time. I was candidly sort of chasing comp. And in that moment, patent lawyers were doing quite a bit better than most other lawyers. That was driving much of my decision. I quickly figured out that that was not the right path for me as soon
Uh-huh.
as I came to understand what that practice looked like. I got exposed to an employment law practice in my first year of law school, which really drew me in. Kind of the human interaction of employment law, I thought was really fascinating. I liked having that direct and immediate impact on people's lives.
Hmm.
So that pulled me away from my interest in patent law.
Hmm.
And then working in that employment law firm all through law school, I wasn't close enough to technology. Like I knew that I wanted to do something that was more directly engaged with the way technology was evolving. So I ended up changing direction again and not going into an employment practice.
Hmm. So what kind of law did you finally decide to do? What did you finally decide to do after law school?
So while I was still in law school, I ran a technology consulting firm. I did web design and network
Oh,
configuration and things
interesting.
like that for a bunch of companies and nonprofits in DC.
Hmm.
That resulted, I was very sophisticated, relatively speaking, on the way that law firms and others were thinking about their internet presence and the way that they were engaging with customers and kind of others through technology. I coincidentally, serendipitously, had set up a website about privacy law.
Hmm.
This was back in like 1998. I
Oh,
was
wow.
thinking about Moore's law and how technological kind of power, the power of computing was growing exponentially. And I was thinking about how the cost of storage was going down so dramatically, and the intersection of those two trends just had me thinking that really interesting challenges were going to happen in the space of privacy. So,
Hmm.
as a second year law student, I set up a website, privacylaw.net at the time, and I just started posting information about what was happening in the context of privacy. There wasn't much, to be clear.
No.
It was definitely a nascent area. And then just a few weeks after I set up that website, there was a bunch of attention drawn to a proposed merger. A company called DoubleClick
Uh-huh.
was acquiring a company called Abacus Direct, so online ad tech company acquiring a more traditional offline catalog data company. That was drawing regulatory scrutiny to this space in a level that had never happened before, which resulted in a lot of media trying to understand and describe for folks what was happening, what was at risk. Because I had a website, and there was very, very little on the internet about this at the time, a lot of these reporters found their way to me and asked me to speak as an expert on this topic of
Huh.
privacy law. None of them seemed overly concerned with the fact that I was, in fact, a second year law student and not a licensed attorney yet at the time. So I sort of became an expert because there was a deficit of
Oh, so
expertise.
interesting.
And that set me onto rails that carried me through much of the rest of my career.
Wow, that's so interesting. Well, setting up a website in 1998, I mean, that's still pretty early and everything. That's pretty incredible. And so that kind of catapulted you into a career or an expertise in privacy.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack even there. The part of what motivated me with this website, I was intellectually interested in privacy and computing generally.
Yeah.
It was also right around the time people were thinking about law review competitions and journals, and people were thinking about their summer associateships and sort of that whole process. I was working full time, attending school full time.
Yeah,
I was
right.
stretched super thin. The notion of competing for law review to get yet another time commitment that was going to be uncompensated and was going to draw against my ability to do all these things that were generating revenue for me was not tremendously appealing to me. But I was concerned about the competitive disadvantage I was going to have when I was competing with some of these other students for work following the
Right.
graduation from law school. So I wanted to fill that gap somehow. I positioned the website I was creating as one of the first online law journals. So the way that I captioned it was privacylaw.net, an online law journal, yada, yada, yada. That then allowed me, I had those words on my resume. So firms that were doing automatic searching for people who were on Law Journal, on Law Review, that were going to pick me up. And then at least I'd have the opportunity to engage with them in a conversation about why I was doing something unconventional.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's super interesting. Very entrepreneurial, I have to say. So now your career is a little bit unusual because unlike most law students whose first job is usually joining a law firm, you actually went directly in-house. Tell me a little about how that happened.
So there's a lot of serendipity involved on this one as well. After my website started producing media attention back in 1998, a gentleman named Ray Everett Church, who was a former GW Law alumnus, he reached out to me because he was working for a tech startup in Silicon Valley, and saw that I was doing something entrepreneurial, that I was focused on privacy. He too had done the same thing just a few years before. He was the first chief privacy officer in the US that had ever sort of been formally given that title. And he saw me as a like-minded individual, sort of
Wow.
intellectually and professionally. So he offered me an opportunity while I was still in law school. I became the director of privacy programs for a company called All Advantage, which was a San Francisco-based
Hmm.
ad tech company.
Hmm.
So I took that job while I was still in school. The All Advantage job was the first startup I worked for. That opportunity led to another startup opportunity, which led to yet another startup opportunity. So I went through three startups and then found my way into kind of larger, more well-established companies.
That's so interesting. Now, did you have a hard time deciding to join that original startup out of law school, or it wasn't at the time, it wasn't that hard of a decision?
So it was a very hard decision, but I would say I benefited tremendously from my own ignorance and naivete. So the way the compensation was structured at that time, for that particular opportunity, when you were made an offer, you could choose from three tracks: maximal equity, lowest cash comp, middle of each, or maximal cash comp, lowest equity. None of the cash comp that was on offer at that time would have been sufficient to allow me to live and service my student loans in the
Yeah,
Bay Area of California.
yeah.
I didn't know that. I didn't fully understand it. So I consulted my law school professors and mentors in the Washington, D.C. area. Everyone saw that moment as a gold rush, and everyone has sort of these heady moments where everyone thought people were going to be fabulously wealthy based on IPOs. So they strongly encouraged me to run at this opportunity.
Hmm.
That first startup never made it to IPO, so all of that just vaporized.
Hmm.
It was a relatively low cost experiment for me just because it was so early in my career. But had I better understood the risks that I was taking, I might not have jumped and taken the opportunity, which when you zoom out and take the long view, it set me up for a tremendous amount of long-term success that I couldn't possibly have fully appreciated back then.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. Well, tell me a little bit about each of the in-house opportunities, and they all sound very interesting. How did those come about to you? Were they all happenstance? Were you looking to move at the time? Maybe pick a couple that kind of stand out.
Yeah, sure thing. So when it looked like All Advantage was beginning to arc downward, I think it was Fortune magazine described us as the most bloated whale on the dot-com beach, bleeding money until we died. That was a pretty strong signal that it was time to begin exploring my next opportunity. I had read an article. I was constantly obsessed with sort of absorbing as much information about what was happening in the ecosystems I was interested in. That always served me very well. I read a story about a startup that was coming together out of Boston. There was a student, a medical student at University of Pennsylvania, who was doing his residency. His laptop was stolen, and he and a friend put together a business plan for how to secure and protect the data and recover stolen hardware in that kind of circumstance if your laptop was stolen. I was curious. They had just won the Wharton School Business Plan competition, so they had a
Okay.
good idea, but they were still relatively unsophisticated young people sort of trying to come up with a business. I reached out to him. I tracked down this guy's email address and I emailed him. And I was like, hey, what you're doing is very interesting to me. This is my background. You're going to have relationships with law enforcement, and there is a risk that people will perceive what you are building as being able to be repurposed as a surveillance architecture. I would love to have a chat with you
Hmm.
and help you think through that. Like I wasn't anticipating it was going to turn into a job, but I thought
Wow.
that these were interesting entrepreneurs doing something interesting. I thought I might be able to help them avoid some tripwires just gratis.
Huh. Huh.
He reached back out immediately, offered to fly me to Boston. So I went out there and met this amazing group of entrepreneurs, and we really hit it off. Like it was clear we sort of had a very similar energy, and that turned into my next job. Like they hired me, pulled me out there a few weeks later. I
Mhm.
was working for that company. And then as that one was beginning to arc downward, I got another outreach from an entrepreneur at a company called Ad Knowledge. And they were reaching out to me because they had email deliverability problem. They were a permission-based email marketing company, among a bunch of other things, and they needed to distinguish themselves from spam, which was increasingly being blocked, and they needed someone who was experienced both in thinking through the policy considerations as well as the legal sort of spectrum of questions and opportunities. So that turned into another job where, and none of these things did I fully appreciate they were going to become a segment of my career. It
Hmm.
was always just interesting problems that presented themselves,
Hmm.
and then people that impressed me, people
Hmm.
that had an energy that was
Hmm.
intriguing, that seemed to be passionate about what they were doing, which suggested to me they were about to have an impact. That was massively attractive to me. So I would tend to engage with those problems, and then that pattern tend to play out favorably for me over and over and over again. Every one of these things just turned into another great opportunity.
Well, tell me a little about the obviously being chief privacy officer at Google. I mean, that sounds like a very big job and it must have been extremely competitive. It sounds like an incredible opportunity. Tell me a little bit about what the process was like getting that job.
So it's an interesting story as well. When I was contacted by a woman, one of sort of my primary mentor across my whole career, a woman named Nicole Wong, who was the deputy GC of Google a while back. She had reached out to me suggesting they were looking to level up their privacy program at Google. I had a really interesting and unusual cross section of experiences at that point. At the time, I was the first chief privacy officer for Macy's and Bloomingdale's.
Hmm.
Before that, I had had the job for a company called Limited Brands, and before that, I had been at IBM. So I had done a bunch of high growth startups. I had done big consulting. I had been in online and offline retail. There were just not a lot of people that had stitched together that 360-degree view of how to operate successfully in all those environments. And the scale and ambition of Google, and Nicole's genius was she recognized we need to be thinking about how do we equip ourselves to solve the problems we don't even know we're going to encounter yet.
Hmm.
So she was looking for people who are sort of dynamic and entrepreneurial, and we're always looking around corners. She brought me in just to have a conversation about the opportunity. That was in October of 2010. The interview process continued until March of 2011.
Hmm.
This was back at a time when even an offer at my level went to Larry Page for his signature. He had to kind of sign off on things before they could go to formal offer.
Wow.
Um, I joined the company as a senior counsel, and the day that I was hired, I was advised the company had just signed a consent agreement with the Federal Trade Commission to resolve a dispute around Google Buzz, and it was build a program, ensure
Hmm.
that it's sort of operating at a high level of effectiveness and that will survive external scrutiny. It was about sort of establishing a social graph inside of this sprawling organization that was growing at this historically unprecedented rate. everyone was underleveled. Like no one could be overly obsessed with title at that point. This is
Mm,
2011 in Google. Everyone was operating multiple levels above the title that was on their business card. And I did the work. It was an incredible kind of adventure. I was in the room in those early years. I was in the room with the CEO on a weekly basis. Had an incredible level of senior executive access. I was meeting with the board of directors. I never really paid much attention to my title, and nobody externally or internally really cared about it. And I just leveled up. So
mm,
got promoted from senior counsel to director, director to senior director to VP, and then ultimately they chose to have the CPO title. It's interesting at Google, for the first 5 years of my Google career, they were adamant we are not going to have a CPO. We think the chief privacy officer title is not really a great fit for Google. We are so big and so sprawling, and we want every business leader to be an owner for privacy. It's a
mm,
little confusing to have one person who's tagged as being the chief privacy officer when it's really distributed across this large and federated business. But as years went on, it became increasingly clear we were an outlier. Like
wow.
others were creating this role. Our program was so strong. We took a tremendous amount of pride in it. We didn't want to be left behind. So eventually, in about 2018, we did choose the senior executive team decided, okay, Keith's been doing this job for years anyway. Let's call him the thing that other
Mm,
companies are calling the person
wow.
that's carrying these
Wow.
responsibilities.
Wow. So after you are the chief privacy officer of Google, it's kind of for me, it seems hard to imagine there's a company that's bigger or whatever that has more responsibility, more reach. Is that what made you decide, gee, now it's time to try private practice, or how did that come about?
This is a great question. I had been at Google for almost 14 years.
Wow.
I had built what I still believe was the best in-house team that ever there was to do that kind of work. And many of these folks, we had virtually zero turnover in my team.
Wow.
So I had many team members that had been with me for more than 10 years.
Wow.
Um, any one of them was more than capable of stepping into my shoes and carrying the weight that I had been carrying. And at a certain point, you start feeling a moral obligation to your lieutenants to create space for them. I wanted to make sure that there was runway for them. So on the one hand, I kind of wanted to aerate the organization a little bit and allow
Mm,
space for it to continue evolving and growing. The bigger thing for me over the last few years of my Google career, I had the immense privilege. I joined the board of directors of a company called ZoomInfo, which was still a private company at the time that I joined. I was with them through their IPO, which ended up
mm.
being one of the largest software IPO in a decade.
Oh
That
wow.
exposed me again to being very close to a founder-led company, to being in the room with the board as the company was setting the strategic direction. It was just this incredible, thought-provoking opportunity for me. So that had me thinking about what my next chapter ought to look like.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then as Google's AI strategy continued to unfold, and as the world woke up to the fact that artificial intelligence and LLMs and generative AI are about to change everything,
Hmm.
we'd been working on that for a decade at Google,
Hmm.
but to see it suddenly come to fruition externally and to see this incredible ecosystem of companies flourishing with these remarkable ideas, it was increasingly evident to me that the knowledge, skills, and abilities that I had built up over the last 15 years at Google and the relationships that I had formed with regulators, with folks in venture capital and private equity and policymakers and in academia, I could spend the next 10 years as a champion for one company, or I could zoom out and try to leverage those skills and abilities
Hmm.
to thousands of companies all over the
Hmm.
world, a whole new generation of leaders. And it felt like all of those things
Hmm.
were coming together in a moment that
Hmm.
doing something different, change, it felt like it was the
Hmm.
moment to kind of
Interesting.
step out and sort of make myself uncomfortable.
Yeah. Is that a feeling that had kind of been niggling with you for many, many years, or did you just wake up one day and say, hey, this is what I want to do?
When I joined Google, I told the people closest to me I expected it would be a 3-year run. I had a pattern of staying at places for 3 years,
Okay.
and I tended to get sort of an itch, and I wanted to do something different and change and grow. Google was different in the sense that the company changed so frequently. It grew so quickly, it expanded, it sort of changed which products were the key priorities. So it definitely held my interest for a whole lot longer. But as I had said at the end, like Google, when I stepped away, it was, you know, approaching 200,000 people
Yeah,
in the
right.
organization. I was
Mhm.
leading a massive global team from Singapore to Hamburg. It was the shape of the opportunity was different. And I am definitely, as you probably picked up from this conversation, I'm drawn to entrepreneurs. I'm drawn to
Yeah.
people who are taking big risks and are operating outside of their comfort zone. I want to help people change the world responsibly. Um,
Yeah.
and it was becoming increasingly clear to me over the last few years there was probably a more relevant opportunity for me outside than the incredible opportunity that I was enjoying inside of Google.
Yeah, so interesting. So, well, you obviously now are partnered at Gibson. I know it's super early days, so you probably are barely getting your arms around, and I appreciate you're taking the time to do this because I know you just started, so I'm sure you're super busy. But what's it been like? I mean, you haven't never been in a law firm. Does it feel very different? Is it taking some getting used to? What are your first impressions?
So, I mean, there will absolutely be an adaptation curve. I am grateful for the grace of my partners, for their patience with me and sort of helping to onboard me. If I'm being completely candid and transparent, I didn't imagine I was going to end up at a law firm. That was not the
Okay. Oh,
vision I had
interesting.
for what was going to be next.
Huh.
A good friend of mine, someone who used to be on my team at Google, a woman named Jane Horvath, who was then the chief privacy officer at Apple. She had joined Gibson a little while before. She reached out to me as soon as she got wind of the fact that I was entertaining leaving Google
Hmm.
and had said, you have to have a conversation. This place is different. Something unusual is happening here. So at her insistence, I had a chat with folks here. I ran into a woman named Ashley Berenger, who had been a collaborator. She had been the deputy GC at Meta previously. The three of us immediately had just this incredible energy,
I
this
can imagine.
shared sense of the opportunity space, the leadership of the firm, Barbara Becker, the managing partner. Everyone impressed me so consistently from the first conversation I had all the way through this recruiting process that the firm was making a massive and unparalleled investment
Hmm.
in becoming the destination practice
Hmm.
for all issues related to privacy, data protection, AI, cybersecurity, and they were taking a 10-year view, which I didn't think a
Wow.
large law firm was capable of
Yeah.
doing.
Yeah.
So the entrepreneurial spirit of the practice, the long view that they were taking, the investments they were willing to make, and candidly, just the immense privilege of working closely with folks like Jane and Ashley again, with this kind of support in this moment, it's another moment of incredible serendipity in my career for which I'm profoundly grateful.
And are you having fun doing it?
I have never had more fun. Which again, when I talk to my former colleagues and I talk to my friends across big tech, I think there is a mythology that you can't enjoy this kind of energy, this
Yeah.
kind of growth and
Yeah.
excitement
Yeah.
in a large law firm environment. And that may be true. Again, I am no expert in the way that all of big law is operating. But I actually think everyone needs to pay attention to the way that opportunities are shaping up at places like Gibson, because the energy here is different than anything I ever expected, anything that anybody had ever described to me in
Yeah.
what life at a law firm could be like.
Yeah. Well, Keith, this has been a fascinating conversation. Congratulations on all your success. I would love to check in with you a few years and hear how your practice has grown.
Absolutely. Hopefully, you don't have to wait that long.
This is Richard Hsu and Keith Enright. Thanks.